Welcome to the fourth week of our series, A Christmas Story, where we are continuing to explore and reimagine different Christmas narratives. Last week, we began with the first two themes surrounding Advent, which was peace and hope. This week, we will be talking about the themes of joy and love and what that means for us and our community.
Last week, we opened up with the hope and peace that comes with the Advent. And we stopped because the conversation was rich as we got to reimagine whose hope and whose peace. How does human flourishing actually become alive as we sit in the tension of the Advent season, both the first Advent and the one to come? Now we're stepping into the last two Sundays' themes for the Advent season. That is the joy and love. And today, again, we hope to be able to discuss these in some of our own reflective experience and some of the way the biblical narrative, the Christmas stories have caused us to reimagine how we hold on to joy, love within the gathered community that celebrates this as one of the high holy days of our year.
Yeah. For myself, very similar to you guys, very similar background, coming from that Pentecostal kind of charismatic, not quite evangelical, but still fundamentalist, that kind of background. And in our church, it just was never something that was ever mentioned. Like I think, but I also think that it has to do with even society at the time, like culture at the time, because I remember thinking back from now till then, and like now you go to a store, they have advent calendars, things like that. It's actually part of culture, where back then we had a Christmas calendar. Like, so you still had it was an advent calendar, but no one called it an advent calendar. I didn't hear that term until I was in Bible college, of somebody calling like that moment Advent. It was always like, oh yeah, we had cultural songs about waiting for Christmas, like 12 days of Christmas, different things like that. These anticipation, but it was always situated in like, oh, this is a Christmas this, Christmas that, versus actually using the language of Advent. So I'm just, for me personally, the themes were always there and always present. But I never actually heard like the naming of it from within the traditional church like tradition, or the historical church tradition, um, until I was in Bible college. And my first experience with that was, I think the pastors are named Chris Say and Rick McKinley. They had a thing called Advent Conspiracy. And that was like my first interaction with it. And I was like, what the heck is Advent Conspiracy? And they basically explained what Advent was the anticipation of Christ, and how Christmas has been hijacked by this consumeristic uh, version of Christmas, where we buy ourselves gifts to celebrate Jesus, versus giving gifts to those in need on behalf of Jesus, kind of thing. And so they really were trying to flip the model of what Christmas meant. And so as we sat in that Advent season, they were calling us to actually reimagine and reconsider. And that was my first experience with Advent. And so I'm glad that that was my first experience with Advent, because it actually tied it to social justice versus tying it to just like rote tradition. Because at the time, as much as I've really fallen in love with liturgy and things like that now. But when I was in Bible college, again, just coming from the more Pentecostal background that I came from, if you would say, Carl, man, we're going to do this liturgy for Christmas, I would have rolled my eyes and be like, nah, I'm good, bro. So I'm glad that it came about with this notion of social justice and being able to actually enact change, because that was very much part of the Christmas tradition that I grew up with, right? Like my mom was a pastor, and so every Christmas Eve we used to growing up, we would be part of feeding people in need and things like that, giving Christmas gifts to everybody, and things like that. So I was part of this big celebration of what it meant to actually to actually do what Advent Conspiracy was advocating for. And so when that term was brought in, I was like, oh, that's awesome, because it really gave language to how I grew up. So for me, that was my experience with it.
Um, what's really hit me over this Advent season is actually shrinking joy a bit, because not making joy as that obnoxious person who can never see bad things. They have to pretend the sun is always shining, everything's beautiful and lovely, because that just doesn't work for me. But the joy that we see throughout scripture is linked to the hope that, because we hope that there's going to be a more beautiful world ahead of us, because we have John's Advent hope of the God who would rather be human than be distant, then we can shrink our lens a little bit to take joy in the small moments of humanness. to where I get to experience the divine and being able to experience each other's stories. Where when we come together for our gatherings, and you get to hear different moments in each other, like actually taking joy by finding the virtue and beauty in these moments of humanness, because God never wanted us to be more than human, just wanted us to be more human, as the common saying goes. And that as I get to experience my own humanity and witness the beauty of others, like it's reminded me that the Advent season is about that style of small joy in the other.
Um, I really like what you shared, Glenn. I like how you tied joy to beauty. I think that for a person who has and probably will continue to struggle with depression on some level, my relationship to the word joy is very tense. I often don't know what that means in the way that it's popularly defined, in the sense that, joy is this unshakable happiness and contentment. And especially joy in the Christian world. It's like joy is this um, unmovable thing that you get from the Lord. It's the way that people identify that you are even a believer in the first place. Like, oh, people are just going to see your joy in the struggle. They're going to see your lack of complaining and your just this exuberant countenance that you'll have, and that's how they'll know. But I think for a lot of people, that's just not the reality, whether it be from their circumstances, whether it be from mental health. Joy just doesn't look like that. But I think for me, I would say I actually find a lot of joy in sad things. Personally, I there when I hear a sad story or when I'm listening to sad songs, there's something that feels better sometimes, more real. And I think it's because there's this beauty to it. And like I really something that I when I think of joy, I think of even just being with my community, my family, my friends as they're lamenting, being able to, when something bad happens, stand with them and mourn with them, and sit in sorrow with them. Like for me, I consider that joy. But what I'm really saying in that is that it's beautiful to me. Um, and we'll talk about that later, but it's also connected to the love that grows in those moments. So I really think a way that you could look at joy is also looking at what is beautiful. What do you consider beautiful, and what does that beauty do to you? And I think that there can be joy that's found in those moments.
Oh, that's really good. And I would agree. Like someone who is probably on the more melancholy side of life, like the traditional understandings of not even traditional, I would say our North American Western understandings of joy don't always seem to apply. And part of it, I think, is that we have made joy and happiness synonymous, right? And so like we sit there and think of what is I'm not American, so I'm gonna probably misquote this, but like, is it the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness? Okay, yeah. So like that idea of the pursuit of happiness, and so we think joy is us getting things that make us happy, versus joy, I think, is actually like almost an ineffable kind of quality, or like this unspeakable kind of quality that emerges in the midst of actually profound suffering and things like that, right? You have that phrase, like that unspeakable joy, right? Like that phrasing that comes where you're present together in lament, you're present together in suffering, you're present together in the chaos of this world, but that being present together brings about this qualitative moment that we actually don't know how to put words to. And I think I experience joy a lot more in the midst of that than I do as some sort of fleeting notion of chasing happiness. Right. Like this season of life for me has been really, really crazy, like just full of loss, a lot of grief and a lot of pain in that sense. But at the same time, I could also say this has probably been a season where I've experienced some of the most profound joy that I've ever experienced. And I think it's because like the joy comes from the same place as the pain, in a sense, right? It's the possibility in both places. And if you learn how to be present to your pain, then you can also be present to your joy, because they come from the same place. And that's just something that I've really been learning to understand in this season, that as I embrace the melancholy side of life, the depressive side of life, is also opening me up to embrace the joy side of life. And it's not about like, it's not like, well, that brought me joy. It's being able to be present in the moment, being able to be present to and attentive and attuned to whatever is in front of me actually allows me to be able to experience joy. And that's some, like for me at least, I think is when we think about joy within the idea of Advent, like when we like there's the Santa Clausification version of Christmas where everything is happy, you know, Santa Claus brings you the gifts that you really want. But then there's the real story of Advent where you have this baby born into the lower echelons of society that challenges power, that is present to the suffering of the poor. Um, but in the midst of that, there's joy that enters into the world, the possibility of joy that enters into the world. So I really like just that notion of pain and joy. They seem to be interconnected for me versus the idea of happiness and joy. They actually don't actually make a whole lot of sense together. Like I can experience joy and still miss the fleeting moments of happiness, if that makes sense.
Oh, I really appreciate the way you brought it into being the more human, because a lot of cognitive psych studies have pointed to that in the ability to experience full humanity, that when you shut down part of it, because often we want to shut down what is painful, like you said, what is dark, but as we try to numb that, that our brain is not wired to be able to shut down one part of emotion. It actually does a blanket shutdown. So in striving not to experience the depth of darkness, we actually dim the lights on the highlight of joy. And within this thing that you're pointing to is one, it can fight with some of our notions, because all of us carry some baggage from some of the Puritans that first came over to this country and thought pleasure was bad. But to say that we celebrate this joy actually gives us right to say that we should find some pleasure in our surrounding. There should be some beauty, but it will only be experienced, as you said, to the degree that we can open ourselves up to the full human experience. That we're not just always up. It's not always exciting, but it is a trained habit. In the same ways that melancholy can be self-propelling, um, learning how to discover joy in the moments of struggle and in the moments of togetherness in the not ideal is something that we also, in this time in particular, we get to train ourselves and to remind ourselves that nothing is perfect, nothing is static, but there's always room to find beauty, joy, and like our vision says, hope, beauty, and meaning in this moment. That this is where we get to have that reflective response.
No, definitely. Like in last for the video for last week, Glenn, you talked about when we were talking about hope, and you talked about the idea of like the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it, right? And we create this dichotomy between light and darkness, and it's interesting to me that light only seems bright in the midst of darkness, right? Like they're actually there's an interconnectedness to the light and darkness. It's not necessarily qualitative as this is good, this is bad. It's actually they're both needed in order for us to experience the fullness of light and the fullness of darkness, right? Like both are actually needed to be present for that statement to be true. One doesn't overpower the other in a sense, right? But also it helps me to actually think about um when I'm listening, when I'm reading the biblical narrative, right? Like the most profound encounters of God have also happened under the cover of darkness, right? Like you have in the story of Israel, like the people meet God in a shroud of darkness. When you get to the cross, you have this like the removal of the barriers between humanity, like you know, God and creation happened in the cover of darkness. And so I think like there's like something about being present to the darkness that allows the light to shine forward and even seem brighter for us, and both are needed in the mix of that. It's not about one is good, one is bad. We need to eradicate one in order for the other to survive. They only exist in this interconnected play.
And it's also good to note that when we speak this way, we're also not saying that we should pursue destructive habits, darkness, or anything. It's not a matter of all things are to be pursued, but all things will be experienced. Just because we have had a few moments within community where people are like, oh, I just found the good part of boundaries. I can't take those apart. And we're not saying that. But we're saying the full human experience is to be present in darkness, in pain, in the short-sightedness, and to be able to celebrate the flicker of light that shows that darkness does not win, that sun will rise again, that hope that drives us towards a joy of building is still present.
Yeah, where darkness becomes the canvas upon which light paints.
And like you said, in the first creation account, is like all the needed potential to develop a flourishing life was present in the formless void darkness, the chaotic seas that God hovered over. And it brought out of, it didn't invent, it formed, it was not the idea of origin, but the idea of creation and creating, that things were drawn out of the pain, the dark, and what wouldn't be hospitable to life.
I just wanted to say I really liked what you said about joy and pain coming from the same place. I think that's just a really beautiful and profound way to put it. And then also this idea of sort of light needing or being best seen or understood while also experiencing darkness. Not that we pursue it, but that it's a part of life. And I always found it interesting. I can't remember what science class I learned this from, probably as a kid, but kind of like the idea of how things move in space when it comes to light, and the idea of darkness. I mean, yes, we know that there's things like dark matter, but that darkness is not actually a thing. It's actually the absence of light. Just like cold isn't actually a thing, it's the absence of heat. Um, and so it's not that these things aren't something we experience, or the darkness is some real thing that is fighting with it, but it is an absence. And those absences can be hard, but a lot of time those absences can help us construct meaning, and we can define and redefine what is meaningful to us when we experience absences. And that's also how we define and recognize joy or light when it does come. So it's in those absences that we can uh, find new meaning and sometimes find new joy. But I really love the relationship and those things that came up. So thank you, guys.
And what you're pulling at also goes into one of my favorite verses about what Jesus did when we go to Hebrews 12:2, to where it says, "For the joy set before him, that he endured the cross, despising the shame." That it's that the, at least throughout our tradition, we have this interwovenness that joy is the ability to celebrate and to be fully present in the moments leading towards the ultimate hope. So for the joy of the community set before him, he could endure. And that is the animating power of the joy, to be able to celebrate moments while enduring towards a goal, that we could say that this new community, new creation, new people will be tangible as we build it. And yeah, it's like what you're going, like we've been fortunate enough to have that kind of motif celebrated since some of the first letters.
Love. Also a very subjective word and concept. Can mean a lot of different things for a lot of people. Um, I don't know why the first thing that's popping into my head is love languages. Um, I think that's my like
It's
conditioned Christian
because you're a
brain.
good person who loves words of affirmation.
Oh my
So your
gosh, that's
hair's on point, your words are filled with wisdom.
thank you. Thank you. Stop. Love. Love. I don't know why that's kind of sad. It's depressing. The word love is inspiring as many things to me, but I think that speaks to something. Um, I think for me personally, I grew up in a culture and a household where love was earned. So I think I always hit this wall when I come to this word. Love is something that you receive based off your performance. Um, and I think so many people grow up in homes or cultures or even the church where this is kind of, even though they're trying to say a different message, this is completely what is taught through the actions that um, we experience. And so I think love is the idea of unconditional love has always felt so strange to me, even though that's a term you hear a lot in churches, how God's love for us is described. And so I think when we start with our definition of love that way in life, it can completely sort of disfigure how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about what it means to love the other. I think it can really distort those things. Yet for so many of us, that's how our story and understanding of love begins, is through this performance-based, I have to earn it lens. Um, so those are my first thoughts. I'll just throw that out there.
Well, I'd be curious to then like hear you kind of explore the way that you've understood love then in light of Advent. And so what does Advent say to love, like the way you've heard about, like the way you've understood love, and vice versa? Like how do they actually interplay for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Bringing me back to what we're actually talking about. Um, I I think there is this idea of love in the arrival of Jesus, and that God came in a tangible way, in a way we could touch and experience with our senses. Um, but if I'm allowed to just be fully honest, I know that that's something that we're supposed to hold on to, that he came, that he was here. But living now in this in between where we didn't actually get to experience that, and even though we know that God came and became incarnate, there's still this feeling of God is invisible. So it's like the love that we should be taking from this story, that God came and Jesus did what he did, and we still are affected and receive life from this narrative, and that narrative is supposed to be what helps us go and transform our communities. Um, it's there's still this liminal space of the in between, that's like, I also still can't see you, God, sometimes, and I struggle to see you and feel you. And so that's where I think there's this liminality in Advent of, like, there's one side of, like, yes, we're celebrating the love of God that shows up in this baby, but also waiting for God to return and saying, like, I need more, and I'm hoping and banking on the promise that you love us enough to keep your promise and come back. Um, so those are kind of my strange thoughts on the word love in the context of Advent. Sorry, I know it's kind of off-putting.
It's no, it's good. I think it's actually a great way to move into the concept of love in light of Advent, right? Especially when you began to define the way that you grew, like how love, what love meant growing up, that it was like something you earned, right? And I think for most of us, reality is that the version of Christianity that we grew up in was that love, God's love was something that we earned, right? Like if and if it becomes something that we earn, it can be also something that we can that can then turn away from us as well. And I think love in light of Advent, um, at least it opens up the possibility that love can be redefined, that we can actually be liberated from the ways that we have understood love in the past, right? That we can actually choose, like the Advent creates the space that we can choose to love in a new kind of way, right? That we can actually move, like if we were going to pull on this, the kind of ways that we were talking about themes, like there's love that, if we define it in a certain way, well then it's something that we have to earn. And then there's love if we define it in another way that actually leads us into a new way of being together, to be present, to hold on to the, to bring it back to the joy and the hope and the peace, right? Like love then becomes this almost like thematic thread that begins to bind all these things together in light, and because of Advent we are liberated to experience it in a new way. Like, so like that's just some thoughts that I had in light of even like what you're sharing about love, but then also because I think I have a very similar problem, like Slavoj Zizek's definition of love, that love, like he says, love is evil because when you to love something is to then not love something else, right? Like there's an inherent rejection in love. And I think that's probably the way that I've experienced love, is like, so if I love my family, then that means I don't love these other people over here, kind of notion, versus love is this expansive thing that it's not a pie that there's only so many pieces. It's actually something that grows as we grow, in our understanding of who we are, and as we grow, as humanity grows, love then becomes an expansive thing versus a limited thing or a finite thing.
Well, yeah, because within those notions of love, it becomes a starvation model. There's only so much love that can be given, and so it follows some of the economic critiques. There's only so much of a pie. You can't give some to everybody. So we must be concerned with where we show love. And at least for me, within Advent, when we start talking about these notions of um, unconditioned or conditioned love, I don't find those categories helpful for myself anymore, even though that's what I was raised around. Is like unconditional means nothing to me. That's an abstract form of positivity. I'm like, cool, because at least when I interact with the beings throughout Scripture, in with the different stories of God, of community, there's no such thing as conditioned or unconditioned. There is a reckless pursuit, or like Heschel said, the furious longing of God for humanity. In his God seeking humanity. I know, but it's that notion that the conditioned, unconditioned pulls me into this realm of debating how many angels are on the end of a pin. Advent is loving to me because it was a God who showed up and then said, "In you, I will continue to show up for others." So it's very particular as opposed to universal. It's very incarnate as opposed to unconditioned, because it even is subject to the conditions of my birth, of my locativeness, of how I have resource to give and show. So it's a very coming into that challenges me, that what does it mean to be a community defined by love? And I can't just make it a abstract claim that I am loving. I don't care how you experience my love. It's very much drawn to the particularity of the relationship. If um, you guys had experiences that made the way I presented myself triggering, then it's not loving for me to say, like, I'm just representing myself well and you guys need to get over it. It's only loving if it has the reciprocal response to be able to recognize what bullying is the flourishing. And I think that is the story of Advent. As Athanasius said, God became what we are so that we could become what he is. It's that whoever experiences a position, a security in that moment, divest themselves to enter into another's troubled story. And so love isn't conditioned, or is conditioned, but it's conditioned on our locativeness, our particularity, and is expressed through the potentiality of our lived experience here with the relationships that we invest ourselves into.
Mhm. Yeah, man. I love what you did with that, the terms like conditional and unconditional, because like, yeah, reality is unconditional is a non thing. It's a nothingness in a sense, where like love, in order for love to be love, it actually has to be particular. It has to be conditional. And so when we look at like love through the lens of Advent is literally God moving into the particular. To quote Eugene Peterson's, The Message, God moves into the neighborhood. It doesn't say, like, like he moves into a very particular space and time and locative presence. And even, like the most famous verse that I grew up with, like John 3:16, it's not like God so loved, it's like God so loved and then the particular, you know what I mean, like the world, like the cosmos, and because of that, I think Glenn, you're absolutely right. Like, we need to remove that unhelpful category of unconditional love, and maybe like really pursue, um, as our redefining, in a sense, or as a redefining or reconstructing a better perspective, or reimagining a better perspective of love. Like, what does love look like in the particular? Because that's the only thing that matters. Love, if love is not in the particular, then it's a non thing, and it's this ethereal thing that we can go on and on and on about, we can write songs about, but it's a nothingness.
Well, it never incarnates that way, because it's only within those lived moments that it can become incarnational, because it needs that. So in my head, when you're saying it, it almost sounds like we need to talk about an unqualified conditional love, because we don't qualify it, we don't put the extras, but it is conditioned because it's in response to um, your need, your experience, and how you could name. And it goes back to something Megan said. and it exists within the agencies around us and the multiple tiered agencies as we understand them, that within this incarnative experience, like it was in the first century and has been with the church ever since, it's not a universal maxim that allows us to say, okay, I'm a nice person and I'm generically nice, super generic. I say happy holidays to be inclusive. I make sure to keep 50 cents in my pocket to throw at homeless people so I feel better about systems that crush the dreams of others in an economic structure. And I get to find that cheat piece that you talked about, the one that allows me to benefit from a privilege but never have to critique a system, rather than a love which calls me to the particular that has to hear those who say, actually, the system doesn't love me so much. These things crush my soul to make sure your shoes are cheap. That we have to get into this particular modality that says love is always conditioned by the conditions and particularity it enters into.
This is so good. Like I honestly, until this conversation, I never realized how much the words unconditional and conditions are like are shackles when it comes to the understanding of love, and that love is expressed, like you're saying, in this particular sense. It's expressed in our conditions. We understand it through the specific ways that make up who we are and our communities and our lives. And that I like, Carl, how you also said that love in that sense, it's nothing. Like, can we even say there's such a thing as generic love? Like, can love even, is it love if it's generic? And based on this conversation and what I'm just thinking right now, I would say no. It has to, love comes with attentive presence. And love comes with a desire to know and care for the other. I think love is specifically tied to a sense of knowing, of deep knowing of who that person is. And like you said, a pursuit, there's a pursuit to constantly know more. I always was fascinated that in the Bible, it's translated like when there were sexual relations with someone, that they always said like they and he knew her. And as a kid, I was like, what? I don't understand. Like, what does that mean? But it's just this fascinating concept of like of that being almost interchangeable with the word no. Um, and and I think love in all of its forms could be translated in that sense of knowing. And I think even the word love too, I have a hard, it doesn't, like, as a word, immediately my head doesn't make the connections it needs to about what it means. So I've actually found a lot more power in the word care recently. I know that that kind of seems like a basic or generic word, but for some reason, like when someone says I care about you, recently it's meant more to me than the words I love you. And I think because there is this connotation with it that there's a specificity to that. And like I know who you are, and because I care about you because of that. And I care about you because I know you. I know you because I care about you. And so I always, like, I was even playing with John 3:16, like, for God so cared about the world, like what that does for me, because I think I am trained to kind of have this generic understanding of love. It can have all this like really basic shallow meaning and this deep meaning at the same time. But this conversation has been really helpful for me personally, even just in this moment. So I think that all of these ideas are really powerful. And I love that, like Glenn, you were saying, God loved us because he showed up, and he showed up because he loved us. There's that attentive presence that's a necessary requirement for love.
I like what you're bringing out there, like playing off of Carl's riffing on love becomes meaningless when it becomes universal. Because how often have we struggled with the notion of talking about God's love because we only speak of universality? It's like, well, God loves everyone the same. There's nothing you can do to make him love you more or less. Like, cool. So I'm a blank face in a sea of billions throughout time. And even the way we talk about the idea of what Jesus' advent is, the redemption stories, like when God looks at you, he only sees Jesus. So even at my most hopeful, all I really am is a prop for a mirror. Because like, oh, for love of God, I hope you don't see me. Yeah, it's like, and if it's particular, it means that God enters into my world, into my reality, and into my space and sphere. And this is why I love the Gospel of John so much, is because it uses 4 verbs of desire to get to the highlight. Said, not by the desire of sexual compulsion, not by the desire of a husband, and not by the desire of someone claiming you. So I think it's going towards the idea of the Roman household naming practice, but by the very desire of God, you become family. And so to say that desire has to be particularly aimed at me. And we've all experienced it in gift giving. When someone doesn't know you and gives you one of the most generic things possible, you're like, this actually hurts more than you just saying I didn't have money, because this proves you know nothing about me. And he went for mid-30s and white, khaki pants. That must be it. I'll find some.
Well, and it's interesting that like moving into other like Johannian literature, like in First John, where we get the phrase "God is love," and it's interesting that when we define love as this generic, universal, in particular type thing, um, it's no wonder that people experience God as nothingness in that sense. But when we understand love from the particular, like love says, I want to know you, and not in the Old Testament biblical sense. But love says, I want to know you. Well, then when we say God is love, there's this intimate knowledge of who you are and who God is that begins to be this interplay between creation and creator in a sense. Um, but also in that sense, like when we move again, like if we hold love as the generic, universal, unconditional love just because, like when we say God is love, well, love just becomes a narcissistic projection, because like as Glenn said, like we're just a prop that holds up a mirror that says, so God could be like, ain't I pretty, you know, versus the particular, and saying when God sees you, God loves you, God cares for you. And there's an actual there's the particular, there's the knowledge of who you are, and that's why we can understand God as love. And I think like if we begin to actually begin to think of love in that perspective, when we use the language of God as love, um, I think it offers a lot more hope for the kind of conversations we could have with people. Because I think, like, honestly, when the unconditional love, the unconditional idea of God, and talk about love that way, it's nothingness. And there's no wonder that people are like, well, I don't believe that God exists. Well, because like you can't you can't feel nothingness. But when we begin to talk about love in the particular, and then especially when we begin to talk about incarnation, and then so all of a sudden the way that I love somebody becomes part of the way that God loves creation in a sense as well, because then we're very much talking about the God who cares about the particular. And it's almost, it becomes impossible to, well, it's not impossible because it could be a very cognitive dissonant thing, but it becomes impossible to say, I don't believe something exists if you can actually feel it in your hands, right? And so love in the particular also means that God is in the particular. And that's really what the incarnation is God moving into the particular. And that's for me, like just kind of bringing all of this back around to Advent is that waiting, that anticipation of experiencing God in the particular.
Well, I think where you're going is also it's the challenge, because since we're staying within Johannine literature, it says the light shined in the darkness, but it said the word was the light. The light was the life of all humanity, and this light enlightened all humankind. So if staying within this motif that the love that came in particular allows us to see love in the particular, and that we recognize God and we're able to love God only through recognizing the light within those around us. That it's not supposed to be a self-feeding narcissistic project of just saying, I see light in me, which it'll include that. But it's this promise that as we learn to see in the others around us a particular light, that we'll experience more of God in those particularities, which will be more expansive, inclusive, and shocking than any abstraction that we thought we could keep neat and contained.
Absolutely. And it really redefines, like when we we talk about where Jesus talks about the great, the two great commandments, in a sense: love God, love your neighbor. And then when the scribe, I think it's a scribe or whatever, whoever the adversary is in that conversation, says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus doesn't say, well, we're all neighbors. Jesus actually goes into the very particular and says, this is your neighbor. This is what it means. And so it's just very much a like I don't know, like this has been a really helpful conversation around this notion of love as particular. Is something that I think we need to pursue this conversation more within our community, because I think it's something that has the potential to radically shift the way that we can understand God and understand each other as well.
Well, and I think, at least to me, it puts some weight into the Christmas season. That it's not just festive, but it's a challenge for me to become invested in what is around me, and not just my tight closed unit. But if love is particular and it is meeting you in your particularity, and that also shows some of the light of God, because the light which enlightens all humanity is also in you, that it's going to cause me some discomfort as your particularity doesn't match mine. But we have to say this too is God, and that recognition. But it calls me to learn your particularity, and the only person who could tell me about it would actually be you. It's the ultimate violence for me to tell you your particularity, how you've experienced, or what it is to exist within this world. But it puts me in this rather passionate stance of engagement, listening, and presence, so that I can hear how your particularity has influenced the way the light has shone through you and the way you've experienced God in the other. And so it can't be a passive fallback.
There's nothing passive about love, is what I'm getting from this conversation. That it's extremely active, and that could be listening. It can show up as active listening. And I think probably one of the biggest ways, based off of this understanding of love that we're talking about, that you can show it is by listening to someone else's particular story, particular set of circumstances, and particular needs. But then it's also showing up in their needs in a particular way, and not just throwing at them what you think is the best thing that they need, but taking time to be attentive. And that attentiveness, I think, is where the love starts moving through, and that's how it passes through, is as we're attentive to one another, as we're attentive to our communities, we're attentive to the world. As Jesus came in and was attentive to humanity through his physical body, I think that's where the love starts to break out among us.
And I'd push a little on one of the wording just because of how it triggers in my head. When I hear active, it goes into like this phonetic activity, this compulsive behavior that I must always be moving, to where I almost want to phrase it as love is responsive and responsible. Because when it's active, I have to be engaged at all times. If it's responsive, both of our presence gets to push on the dance level, because it has to be responsive to my own experience as well as responsive to yours, as opposed to just active, where I've seen love that is active pursue to the point of trauma.
That's good. I like that reframing. I think maybe attentive and responsive together in that dance would work really well.
I imagine attentive, responsive are just synonyms at that point. Yeah.
So based on this conversation that we had today, joy, and I love the way that Carl phrased it, joy and pain come from the same place. And that joy doesn't always necessarily have to be even related to happiness, but it can be the way that we understand beauty in this world. And for love, I have learned that the words conditional and unconditional may not always be the best framing for us to experience or understand love, but looking through it through the lens of being attentive and responsive to each other, to our communities, that is a way that love can be experienced, and that it is specific and particular.
I'd say for me, what I heard through the joy is that joy is not just euphoric. It is the full human experience and learning how to celebrate the moments of light and darkness, learning how to hold on to something that is worth pursuing, even if there's some pain in the pursuit. That joy is that drive, that hope, being able to see the cracks of new life and new creation come into this world, and celebrating those. And that's what we learn how to do with joy, is we sit in those moments to be open to the pain, but also to the celebration where light breaks through. And then as we moved into what does it look like in Advent to have love, and I'd say it almost feels, as Quippy is saying, love is always locally sourced, not big box stores. It's something that has to be rooted within its community and responsive to its conditional nature, to where the big box is universal and offers the same product to every person. It doesn't care. That love moves us into the particularity of the local business that grew up within that community. And that's what it looks like for us to be that particular and responsive.
That's good. I think for myself, just in trying I've been trying to think of a concise summary phrase. And I think that for me is that both joy and love are about being present to the particular. And so Advent, then looking at those in light of Advent, is that we are moving, coming, and arriving with Christ into the particular spaces. And as we do so, that's where the joy and the love, and I would also, going back to the last stuff that we talked about, where the hope and the peace is also experienced, is in the particular. And anytime that we try to make it generic, it becomes nothingness.